You're listening to the VSL Aviation Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Lake, and thanks for listening. If you're joining us on live, anyway, we're live streaming this on YouTube and Instagram, but primarily is on Discord. So we're recording this on Discord. If this is the first time you're hearing the podcast, I'm a CFI and DPE, give a lot of aviation advice, and run a little YouTube channel and podcast to help you prepare for your check ride and just all things general aviation knowledge. So this is just a weekly show that we do to answer your questions, and I've got about 3 topics that I'm going to cover first and then open up for questions for people that are joining us on Discord. But you can also type in your messages on Instagram or YouTube if you're watching us there, or Twitch. I forgot about Twitch. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to start today by talking about ADS-B. So probably most pilots are familiar with ADS-B. Now this is a new requirement that came out a few years ago, and the requirement was in certain types of airspace, you would need to have this extra little widget that's tied into your transponder, and this widget, ADS-B, it broadcasts out your position, a fairly exact position with GPS coordinates and everything every, several times a second. And if another aircraft is equipped with this, they'll be able to see you on some sort of traffic display. Now, previously, this was only available to aircraft, really transport category aircraft, through a system known as TCAS. So ADS-B, when it got rolled out, and when I'll kind of explain what I mean by rolled out here in a second, but when that technology began being used and mandated by the FAA, it really opened up a huge tool for us in the general aviation community, where we could actually see, for the first time, we could see all the traffic around us. And it's been a huge increase in safety, I think. No telling how many incidents or close calls have been avoided because you can see the other aircraft there. But just like a lot of us expected, in 2019, after ADS-B was mandated, our concern was that everybody would get used to having ADS-B on board, and they would begin being complacent with other aircraft having ADS-B, and basically assuming that, hey, all aircraft are equipped with ADS-B, so I'll be able to see everything on my iPad's traffic display, because that's the way a lot of us are using this. But also, we have panel-mounted solutions that bring in ADS-B traffic display on a panel-mount GPS unit, such as like a Garmin 750 or Garmin 650, or even the smaller Garmin units. Heck, even Garmin 430s have a traffic display. So the problem is, now we've got about 90% or 80%, I don't really know the exact numbers, but the majority of the general aviation fleet has now been equipped with ADS-B. So this brings up 2 problems. The 10%, or however many you want to assume, 10 to 15% of the fleet that's not equipped with ADS-B, that means their position isn't showing up on your traffic display. And because we've grown accustomed to being able to see all those aircraft on our traffic display, I think that skill of spotting traffic just with your 2 eyeballs, I think that has atrophied a little bit. And we've grown complacent as a community in general aviation. And we've actually seen some recent mid-air accidents that I think probably have ADS-B as a contributing factor. Notably, there was one about a year ago. I didn't pull up the accident statistic here, but most people have heard of this accident where there was a Cessna 150 in the pattern and I believe it was a twin Cessna doing a straight in to the same runway. And the twin Cessna wound up hitting the Cessna 150, and everybody in both aircraft were killed. I don't know how exactly many. I think there was at least 2 to 3 people were killed in that accident. And the Cessna 150, I believe, was not ADS-B equipped. So the Cessna 310 probably was, equipped, or at least the pilot had some sort of ADS-B in device. And I think, that'd be hard to prove, but I think the opportunity for complacency is definitely there. So it's a big concern of mine. The other one that we've run into recently, and this came up in our DPE meeting yesterday, is the fact that even if a plane is equipped with ADS-B, a lot of the owners are unfamiliar with how to test if that ADS-B is working appropriately. So this could pose even a bigger hazard, where you as an owner, you think that you're ADS-B equipped, but you're actually not sending out the proper codes, I guess, information through the ADS-B system, and people aren't seeing you as showing up on their traffic displays. If you are equipped with something like a tail beacon. The tail beacon is a STC. It's a supplemental type certificate for ADS-B compliance. And the big benefit of the tail beacon is that you can install it on like a nav light or a tail beacon, and it sends out the ADS-B information independent from your transponder. It still uses the aircraft's transponder, but it doesn't require you to mount anything inside the panel. So it's a commonly used one in smaller, older GA aircraft where avionics have gotten quite expensive, and doing a big upgrade like that can be difficult, but you can put on this tail beacon and be compliant with ADS-B in a relatively cheap and short amount of time. So there's a benefit there. Now, there's something that comes with that STC that's called a continued airworthiness instructions. So these continued airworthiness instructions actually state that the ADS-B, the aircraft's transponder, needs to have a current inspection for that STC to be valid. So before, if you had an aircraft that maybe didn't have the 411 and 413 inspection done, you had the option to basically, you could just turn the transponder off and not operate it, and you could still fly in airspace that doesn't require a transponder. But once you install the ADS-B tail beacon, or whatever ADS-B solution, now that transponder has to be on. Not only does it have to be on, but it has to have a valid inspection. So you get kind of this catch-22 where if you turn your transponder off, you're now disabling your ADS-B system and also violating its STC. So that's not required, or that's not allowed. So the point is, you need to make sure that your transponder is operable and has a current 91, 411, and 413 inspection on it, especially if you're flying IFR. That's definitely required. But if you're in a Class Charlie or Class Bravo airspace or plan on flying there, you need to have those inspections done. But you also need to make sure that your ADS-B is actually operating correctly. And so for that, the FAA has a couple of tools for us. One I'll pull up here is the Public ADS-B Performance Report Request. So I'm going to drop this link in the chat here on Discord. If you're not joining us on Discord, I'll try to remember to put it on the actual YouTube video. But this is a FAA website, and you can go in here and you can put in your flight date, and you put in information, identifying information about your aircraft. And once you fill all of this out appropriately and hit submit at the bottom, it will start basically an automated check of your ADS-B system. Now, some owner-operators may have actually received an automated either email or letter from the FAA letting them know that their ADS-B system wasn't performing properly. So some of these letters can come out automatically. But as owner-operators, we really should be doing this. Our FSDO recommended doing it about once a month. So it's something that I'm considering adding to my plan of action as a DPE, and making sure that when an applicant shows up for the check ride, they've done one of these tests and in at least the previous 30 days to make sure that that ADS-B system is working, because that is now part of the aircraft's airworthiness, right? If this comes back and the ADS-B, and it will show up as, I should have had one of these ready, but it will show up as a table of information, and you'll have lines that are highlighted in red for something that's not performing appropriately. Now, just because it's the FAA, they made it even more confusing, and there's some things that show up red that's okay. So one of those fields is, I believe it's operation above flight level 180. If it's a UAT transmitter, some of the lines will be red anyway, because you're effectively limited in altitude, that you can't operate that above flight level 180. So sometimes red is okay, but sometimes it's bad. At any rate, it's good to know beforehand, and then you can ask an AMP, or I believe they have a little, secret decipher coder there on the website where you can see, am I actually operating correctly? Another way you can do this, you can do it live while on flight following. If ATC has enough bandwidth, I guess, they can actually do some sort of ADS-B check, and they'll actually provide you with a ticket number over the radio. I've heard this happen to a couple of different people doing ADS-B checks. I don't know exactly how it works. I've never done it personally, but I have used this website to perform an ADS-B check. So that's one thing about ADS-B that I wanted to cover. The second one, I'm going to pull up this window here. And again, if you're listening along, what I have pulled up is the FAA's website. And if you wanted to find this website for yourself, you could just Google search, which Google's the best way to search the FAA, like I always say. But you can Google search the FAA ADS-B prediction tool, and this will take you to the ADS-B prediction tool for the FAA, and this is an entry form. It kind of looks like, actually it looks identical to the old FAA flight plan form. So the way you fill the form out is you fill out all the information that you would normally for a FAA flight plan. Now this isn't filing a flight plan, and I think it has a disclaimer on here. But you fill this out, and the reason you would use this is if your ADS-B was inoperative and you were needing to fly the aircraft to a location to have it repaired, which this is a common thing around where I live anyway. We don't have a lot of avionics shops that are co-located on the field, so you'd need to fly elsewhere to get that fixed. And I think I brought this up on the last live stream after we had recorded, so I wanted to bring this back up because it is related to our ADS-B discussion that we're kind of having today. But you would go to this website, fill this out, and it would give you an automatic approval to fly with your ADS-B not working. Now, you only have, I believe it's 2 hours. So if the flight, it's 1 or 2 hours. So if you are taking off more than 2 hours past when you filed this, and it'll tell you in the automated email, then it's no longer valid and you need to do another one. And it will use the color code scheme. It'll send you a green, it'll be green on the email saying, hey, you're approved, or it'll show up as red and it'll give you a reason why you're not approved. So that's a useful tool if you are in an aircraft that doesn't have ADS-B operating and you want to fly it somewhere to get it fixed. Now, what this is not for a long-term discrepancy on your aircraft, right? If you've got a long-standing discrepancy on your aircraft and the ADS-B isn't working, don't use this tool to continue flying around. That's not the purpose of the tool. The purpose is to get you that one-time flight waiver to a location to have it repaired. All right, so that is our discussion about ADS-B. Oh, well, to continue with that just a little bit, one of the things the FSDO recommended, and this may have been one of the FSDO employees or one of the DPs, I don't remember, but I thought it was a really great idea. If you're in an aircraft that is not equipped with ADS-B, I would recommend you start making your radio calls, just the normal, November 1, 2, 3, and then just say negative ADS-B. Maybe you don't have to make it on every radio call, but definitely periodically when you're at a non-towered field especially. That, I think, is a really useful call to make because I would appreciate that as a pilot. If somebody called negative ADS-B, that would explain to me why, the traffic scenario that I'm seeing on my iPad traffic display doesn't really make sense because I'm hearing people make radio calls, but I'm not seeing the corresponding tail number on my traffic display. So having somebody telling me over the radio, hey, we're negative ADS-B, I think that's really helpful. So I thought that was a great idea. Technique only, you don't have to do that, but I think that's very useful, especially at a non-towered field. So I'd like to see more people adopt that. All right, so that's our ADS-B discussion. Now I'm going to move on to the next topic, and that was something that a lot of the DPEs in yesterday's meeting brought up, which is people or pilots are struggling with forward slips. So this is something that I've noticed as well, is the forward slip seems to be one of those maneuvers that either instructors are not teaching at all, they're not teaching correctly, or maybe I think they're maybe a little scared to teach or hesitant. And I'll justify that by saying a couple different things. When I'm doing a CFI check ride or a commercial check ride, a common question that I'll ask is when I'm evaluating your spin avoidance or spin recovery, when we're having that discussion, I'll often ask, is a spin going to happen? Or, basically ask you to explain to me when a spin's going to happen. We bring up the conversation of, will a spin happen if I'm stalled and uncoordinated? And I would say 9 times out of 10, most applicants tell me that yes, if I stall the airplane and it's uncoordinated, the plane will spin. And that's just not the case, right? We can get in a cross-controlled scenario, specifically a forward slip, and the plane is not going to spin. Now, the plane will still stall, but because of the aerodynamic characteristics of a forward slip, that lower wing has a much lower angle of attack, and the high wing has the higher angle of attack. So your advancing wing has a low angle of attack, retreating wing has a high angle of attack. If that retreating wing stalls, the high wing will drop, meaning you'll go to a wings level scenario. and you'll have a little bit more time to recover before the plane enters a spin. But interestingly, and I don't know if it's a purposeful design by the manufacturers when they were making training aircraft, but all the training aircraft I've tested this in will not spin from a slip condition. And even some non-training aircraft, I tried this in an aerobatic, 2 different aerobatic aircraft, where I put the aerobatic aircraft in a full forward slip and pull the nose all the way up, and I cannot get the plane to spin. It just won't do it. So I would suggest you go out and fly with an instructor and get comfortable with those forward slips. But before you do a forward slip to landing, go up to the practice area, get in a forward slip condition, about 3,000 feet. As one of the older school DPs says, get it about a mistake and a half high enough to not hit the ground if you do get into a spin. But get it about 3,000 feet and put the plane in a full forward slip. And what that is you're going to go power to idle. You're going to give it full left or right rudder. So let's say you use left rudder. So full left rudder, and you're going to use an appropriate amount of right rudder to hold a heading. That's all you're going to do. Enough aileron to hold a heading. And then as you're holding that configuration, you're going to gently pull the nose up to bleed speed off. You're powered idle, right? And so as the speed decays, you're going to approach the stall. You'll probably get a stall horn. Keep pulling back, and the plane, you'll feel the noticeable buffet. And then take note of your airspeed and take note of your sink rate. And what you'll see is something very similar to the indications of a spin. You're going to see a stable and low airspeed at or below stall speed, and it's going to stabilize there. And you're going to see a very high sink rate develop. And the plane is just going to basically flutter down to the ground. It will not enter a spin. If you're in a Cessna or a PA-28, it just won't spin. It won't. So doing this exercise, I think, helps build confidence in the condition of a slip, which I think a lot of aviators, a lot of young pilots are uncomfortable in a slip because they see that they're uncoordinated. And all that they've been told is, hey, if you stall and you're uncoordinated, you're going to spin. And if you spin, you're going to die. That is kind of being a little dramatic there, but that's not far from the truth. I think a lot of people think that. So the key is to get comfortable in all operating envelopes of the aircraft. There is a question that just came across on Discord of, do you need to be in utility mode to do this maneuver? No, you don't have to be utility rated. This is essentially just a stall. You're not doing anything aerobatic. The bank angle should not exceed, it really shouldn't exceed 30 degrees of bank. And your pitch attitude definitely won't exceed 30 degrees. So it's not aerobatic flight in any form. Now, if you are going out and you're going to practice spins, and this is a great exercise to do if you're in a spinnable aircraft, is to do full slips to stalls and then do a skid to a stall. And if you do a skid to a stall, that's what's going to enter you into a spin, basically immediately. And the key difference between a slip and a skid is in a forward slip, you're going to have top rudder. And what I mean by top rudder is if the plane is banked to the right, so you're flying along to the right, your left leg is going to be on the top side of the plane, right? And you're going to have full left rudder. So that's the top rudder. Now, conversely, if you're in a right-hand bank and you have a lot of right rudder, that's the bottom rudder. So imagine you're doing a base to final turn, a left base to final, which is pretty common, right? So you're in this left turn, and you add too much left rudder to try to cheat that turn, bring the nose around because of overshooting wind, you're putting yourself in a skidding condition. And a skid is much, much more dangerous than a slip. A slip is actually a very stable and good maneuver. So I would like instructors to go up and start practicing these slips at altitude and then have their students practice slips to land. And the slip to land, let me change the stream here real quick. I'm going to pull up the ACE guide, really just the Airman Certification Standards for Private Pilot. All right, so there's the ACS for Private Pilot. Let's pull this up. This is in Area of Operation 4, which is our takeoffs and landings, and Task M is our forward slip to landing. And so the skills here, we've got 9 skills that we have to demonstrate that are related to slips. You do have the knowledge and risk management items, but they're basically the same as most of the other landing tasks, so that's not that different, you know. But it basically says you're going to perform a slip while maintaining your center line and a stable approach, essentially. to a landing surface. And you can combine this with a normal landing, right? And let's read through here and see. Let's see. I'm going to pause just for a second while I read this, just to make sure I'm not giving you bad data. Yeah. So skill 8 is where the touchdown. So we need to touch down at the proper pitch attitude within 400 feet beyond or on a specified point with no side drift, basically a stable landing. So that 400-foot aim point, and you can combine this with the normal landing. You could also combine it with a short field, so the forward, or soft field for that matter. But the forward slip to landing doesn't have to be its own maneuver, but it can be combined with one of the other landing tasks. Now, when you're an instructor or you're a student out here practicing this, a good way to set this up is to make a level turn on your base. So normally at the point where you're turning base, you're also in a slight descent, right? You started that 3-degree glide path down on your stable approach. To set yourself up for a slip, I would make a level turn until you're about halfway through, so about 90 degrees through your base turn, and then I would start that descent. And that's going to put you high enough where you can correct it with a forward slip, and it won't put you so high that you're going to be unstable. And I would define unstable as having to hold anything more than 1,000 feet of descent rate underneath 300 feet AGL. So under 300 feet AGL, I really want that sink rate to be below 1,000 feet a minute. But in a forward slip, you're typically going to see 1,100, 1,200 feet a minute in a good forward slip. That'll give you that excess sink rate to correct a high approach or something like that. The other thing you can do, this is kind of a fun exercise as a CFI, or if you're with a student and you want to do this, is go up with your instructor and have a slowdown competition. This is kind of fun to do, but you can get the plane cruise level flight, and the goal is to get the plane in slow flight as fast as possible, hold slow flight for, let's say, 5 seconds, and then get out of slow flight back at cruise. And whoever wins, or whoever has the shortest time, wins the competition, right? And most students, they're just going to pull the power. And we're sitting there slowing down. They pull power. We finally get into slow flight. They get configured. All that's appropriate. Okay, and let's say that took them 90 seconds to do that whole iteration. So then I'll take the controls. And from a cruise, I'll pull the power back to idle, but not only will I go back to idle, I'll put the plane in a full level forward slip. So I've just increased the drag tremendously. And the ability for the plane to slow down just went way up, right? Now I'm not losing altitude. I'm going to have back pressure to maintain altitude, but I'm basically using the side of the airplane as like an air brake, and I can slow down a lot faster. So using that forward slip to slow down rapidly, that's a valid use of the forward slip as well. It's even talked about in the Airplane Flying Handbook as a legitimate use of a forward slip. So let's say you're trying to enter the pattern and there's an aircraft that cuts in front of you. I can use the forward slip to slow the aircraft down rapidly to, correct pattern spacing or something like that. So that's the forward slip. Make sure you're practicing it as a private pilot. Not only private, you need to use this throughout your flying career, but a private pilot, it is required. Task M is a required item. And we had a couple of DPEs in the room say that they were at flight schools that never trained the forward slip because they didn't think it was a required maneuver. One other thing I'll say is some aircraft, like the Cessna, will have certain models of the 172 that do not recommend slip with flaps. So if you are taking your test in an aircraft or training in an aircraft that has that placard on the it'll usually be a placard by the flap handle. If it says do not or avoid slips with flaps, then you need to abide by that in training, and especially your check ride. That could result in a disapproval if you start slipping the aircraft with flaps. And I know it says avoid, and the reason I think it says avoid and not restricted outright is when you're doing a proper crosswind landing technique, that's essentially a forward slip. Is crosswind landing. You're using a cross-controlled method to account for that crosswind. You're using a forward slip. So if the Cessna came out and said, "Hey, you can't slip at all with flaps out," then that means that you couldn't do an appropriate crosswind landing. So the intent of that is to use a forward slip to lose altitude on final. So don't do that. And in that case, you're just going to do a clean, flaps up configuration. Do your forward slip to landing. So you wouldn't want to combine that with the short field, of course, because the short field is going to require some flaps. So you'd combine that maneuver with a normal landing. All right, and if there's any questions on that, I can address those at the end. The next thing I'm going to go to is special emphasis areas. This is something that got brought up in the meeting yesterday from some of our older DPEs that really did most of their career using the practical test standards. And of course, over the past basically 5 years, we've essentially changed every test over except the CFII to the Airman Certification Standards, and we've stopped using the practical test standards. Well, one of their complaints was the practical test standards had a series of topics called special emphasis areas. So these special emphasis areas were topics that the FAA wanted to put special emphasis on, right? And they were wondering, hey, where did all these topics go? Because they're not explicitly called out in the ACS, right? The FAA went from saying every pilot has to be tested on all of these special emphasis areas to now we go to the ACS and you can kind of pick and choose. You don't have to do one knowledge, one risk management, and then all the skills. And their worry was that we've added a ton of risk management items, a lot of knowledge topics. And there's just so much information in the ACS that you can't test all of it, right? You have to only pick and choose certain items. So that means that there could be holes in the knowledge developing in certain pilots that don't get these important topics covered. So I thought, it would be good to show people where to find, because you can still find these special emphasis areas, and especially you instructors out there, if you're wanting to know, hey, what are some important topics that I need to be covering with all my students? Where could I find those? And that would be in the CFII PTS, because it's our only PTS that we have left. So going back to our VSL, and that's for fixed wing. I think helicopter and maybe balloons and other things have PTSs, but for fixed wing, it's only our CFII. So our CFII PTS in the special emphasis area, it's on page 10 of that that practical test standards document. And there you'll find the special emphasis areas. And right now there's 15 special emphasis areas. And this is specific to instrument flying, right? Because it's the CFII. But a lot of these are just good topics to go over with your student. You can still find them here, the 15 items. You can't find the ones for the old CFI. If you've got an old CFI PTS, those are in there as well. In the front section of the PTS, you'll find the old special emphasis areas as a CFI. So for you CFIs out there, or for you hard-charging pilots that are looking for that next thing to study, these are kind of this is the old method that the FAA would say, hey, here's the things we really want you to focus in on. These are our special emphasis areas. So I think that's still good to bring up there. All right, lastly, we're going to talk about something out of an aircraft's type certificate data sheet. And this question came up in, I believe, our Discord. And so I've got the type certificate data sheet for the Cessna 172 pulled up here. So if you're joining us live, you can see that now. And I'm going to highlight right here it says, hey, if this propeller, if I'm flying a 172 and it has the Macaulay propeller, the static RPM cannot be over 2360 and not under 2230. So we're going to go with that one. There's 3 options in this model of Cessna 172 for potential propellers. And because this plane has been around a very long time, there's other supplemental type certificates or STCs for other types of propellers. So you just have to look through the TCDS or the STC of the aircraft that you're flying to figure out what is the permissible static RPM range. And this is a really important thing to look at on every takeoff, is figure out what your static RPM is and make sure that you're meeting that when you take off. Now, the reason I say on takeoff is we're not typically doing a full power run-up, right? You go to the run-up area, you're probably going to 1700 RPMs and checking the mags, something like that, whatever the checklist specifies. But most checklists don't require you to go to full power in the run-up, and I don't know that that's a real good practice. I don't think that's important. But when you take the runway, typically people are going to hold the brakes for just a little bit. They're going to increase power, let it stabilize, release the brakes, and go full power. Now, in that initial moments of your takeoff roll, you're essentially static, right? And this, remember, the TCDS says static RPM because your RPM could be much higher when you're flying because the windmilling force of the plane going through the air is going to allow the prop to spin faster than it would in a static condition. So that initial roll, you're going to have the opportunity to see essentially what is your static RPM. And so you need to have that number written down on your checklist or somewhere or memorized and known that, okay, I've released the brakes, I'm at full power, airspeed's alive, there's my RPM, I'm making 2,350 RPM, whatever it might be. We had somebody in the Discord server that aborted a takeoff. Maybe not aborted the takeoff, but they were in the pattern basically, and they just thought, man, this propeller, the RPM just seems to be low. I don't think this engine is performing like it should be. And they canceled the flight, and they checked the static RPM on the ground, and it wasn't getting to the specified amount speed. So I didn't hear back from that user about what the diagnosis of that is, but I've had this happen personally before, and that's the way that we identified we had a mag that was giving us issues, and the plane wasn't creating enough power or rated power. So we were actually taking off at like not full power and flying around. And we would have identified that sooner had we been disciplined in checking that static RPM was correct. So that's something that I always check for now. So that's a public service announcement. Look at your type certificate data sheet for the plane that you're flying, figure out what the static RPM check is, and work that into your initial takeoff flow to make sure you're making proper power. All right, that's my last topic for the week. Appreciate everybody listening in on that. And do we have any questions? If you're with us on Discord, you should have the ability to request to speak. And I'll see your hand raised, and I'll invite you onto the stage, and you can speak your question and chat with me here live. If you are on Instagram or YouTube or Twitch, you can just type in your question there in the dialogue, and John will relay that over to me. On that note, John is a CFI up in the Northeast, and he is key in helping me put these live streams on. So, John, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Seth, you kind of introduced me. I don't know how much more there is to say, but I am a CFI in the Northeast, helping out from the technical side of things.
Warren, is it Warren G? All right, welcome. What can I answer for you?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Awesome. Yeah, so this is Gary Warren down here from Runway Aviation, Maine, Arkansas.
Hey, Gary. Yeah, Gary and I did a private pilot check ride. What was it? 2 months ago?
December 12th.
Okay, yeah. There we go.
So my question was, you was talking about the forward to slip landing and the use of flaps. So on my very first 150 cross mile or 150 mile solo, on my second airport, of course, I'm student, nervous and everything. I come in a little high, and I thought, well, I can just slip to get down instead of going around and having to, do all that. And I just 20-degree flap slipped and got down and landed. Well, when I got back, me and my instructor discussed this, and that's when I found out that, hey, that's not a good idea with the 20-degree flap. And you kind of reiterating that. So you're saying at no point in time, if you're on a final, that it's acceptable to slip using flaps. Is that correct?
Well, only if the aircraft you're flying has a restriction on that. So there's a flight manual restriction for specific models of the 172 that restrict that, and probably other aircraft. But if there's no restriction on that, then slipping without flaps or slipping with flaps is fine. Now it's, there's probably some debate to be had there, but as long as it's not restricted, I don't have a problem with it. I've definitely flown aircraft and slipped with flaps. That's fine.
Okay, so the main thing is airspeed is king. Just be on top of that, and everything should be great.
Yeah, and that's part of becoming comfortable with it, is if you're uncomfortable with slips, you think you're really close to a spin, then you wind up just not slipping enough, and really you're not doing anything. So you want to be comfortable enough with it. Go up and practice, and I would practice with flaps and do it in clean configuration and just get really comfortable with them, and you'll see if there's any bad characteristics with your specific aircraft if you do slip with flaps. But that's why you need to go practice them up high, so if you do run into any weirdness by slipping with flaps, you'll find that out with plenty of room to recover.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. I'll sit back and enjoy the rest of the podcast.
All right, thanks. We'll see you. All right, John, what else we got?
All right. And yeah, like things like the Cherokees, anything Piper, there's no restriction on. Some of the early model Cessnas do have a prohibition against it, and then they kind of kept something like that, but instead of prohibition, they just say they don't recommend it, which again is not a restriction. It's just a carryover from the original design.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. I think there are maybe one or two models that outright prohibit it, but most of them just say not recommended.
One person, Carson Sabine, is a student pilot and is wondering how they should input their descent profile into ForeFlight since the POH does not have descent information and they're flying a Piper Warrior.
Well, your performance profile, if you're building a custom performance profile, you have the option to put in a descent. It's not required, though. Your basic profile only requires you to put in your cruise speed and your cruise fuel flow, so you could leave your descent profile out of there. So I don't know if that's what they're asking. I do have a video on my YouTube channel about how to create a top of descent in ForeFlight and actually show that on there. But as far as the descent profile goes, I guess, you can build a basic descent profile by just putting in your expected fuel burn and airspeed. What I'd recommend there is err on the side of caution there. Build in a little bit of extra padding. So I would put, if your cruise speed, for instance, on 172 is probably around 115, and your fuel burn is going to be around 8 gallons an hour for cruise, for the descent, I would put, 115 and maybe 6 gallons an hour, a little bit less. It's not going to have a huge impact on your fuel planning. And that's why ForeFlight doesn't require you to even input that. It'll just extrapolate your cruise fuel flow and speed into your descent, assuming that you're not going to slow down for the descent.
A question about the new maneuver for the CFI ACS area at X task B. Do applicants need to demonstrate it with both clean and dirty configurations, or is only one enough?
All right, for that, let me change the stream over. I think I know the answer off the top of my head, but what they're talking about is the new Airman Certification Standards for CFI introduced a new maneuver that actually everybody, I really like it. I think it's one of the best maneuvers that's on the check ride. And it's kind of referred to as a drag demo. It actually existed, something like this existed in the multi-engine section, but now it's in the CFI ACS. And so if we go to the slow flight stalls, the area of operation 110, task A is just plain old maneuvering during slow flight, easy peasy, nothing to it. But task B is the demonstration of flight characteristics in various configurations and airspeeds. So to answer your question, like with any ACS, you have to do one knowledge topic, one risk management item, and all of the skills. So there are 6 skills, and I believe two of these skills have subsets to them. And so you have to do each one of these skills. So in that demo, you have to do the drag configuration, basically in a clean configuration, slow flight, landing configuration demonstration, and then return to both of those. So you have to do it both clean and configured because you have to do each one of those skills. So I think that's the question that they were asking, if we have to do one or the other. Is that right, John?
Yeah, that sounds correct.
Yep, so you got to do both.
So Ryan on YouTube is asking, I assume a CFII, but he says he understands RNP and how to teach RNP. But he wants some help explaining PBN and how you would teach that to a student.
Performance-based navigation is PBN. So first of all, I wouldn't lose a lot of sleep or waste, as the opposing bases podcast would say. I wouldn't waste a lot of your iceberg space and penguins on teaching PBN. I'm not saying that it's not important, but PBN is more of kind of an advanced navigation. So this would be one of those things as an examiner for a new instrument pilot. Even a CFII, I would expect a basic kind of surface level knowledge of what PBN is. But for all the tasks in a Part 61 check ride for either instrument or the CFII, you're not really demonstrating. You can't. We're not using equipment that's going to use that performance-based navigation, that PBN. But the essentially what it is your ability, well, trying to think a good way to say this is what I would be happy with hearing. Really, literally an instrument student just knowing, hey, performance-based navigation is my ability for my navigation equipment to compare itself to something else and verify its performance. I guess a basic level of PBN that we have is you're going down to LPV minimums. You're using WAS. So WAS is kind of it might be a subset of that. Your GPS is using what's called fault detection and exclusion. So it can detect the fault because of that WAS signal with any bad satellites, and it basically says, hey, this satellite's bad, and it can exclude it from that. That's still not really PBN. PBN is where I would have two separate navigation units. Well, to keep it simple, we'll say I have two 430s, and those two 430s are always comparing themselves to one another. And if one of them detects an error, it's going to alert you as the crew and tell you that you're not able to fly in that level of RMP. So hopefully that's PBN. Maybe I dug myself a hole there a little bit, but I wouldn't worry too much about having like a master's level teaching of PBN, because it's kind of hard to teach when you're just using a 430 or 650. Matt S. So we've got something on Discord here. So Matt is, I'm currently training a private pilot in a J3 Cub, and safe to say the flight manual for the airplane is quite sparse. It is. It's like an owner's manual, it's pretty, there's not much there. His question is regarding to Area of Operation 1, Task F, Performance and Limitations. How would I as an examiner go about evaluating a student whose airplane has zero performance data for takeoff, landing distance, fuel consumption, cruise, etc., like the J3 Cub does? As far as the training goes, I'm having the student utilize a Cessna 172's performance data to go through the motions of calculating currently, so they'll be familiar with using the charts when going to other airplanes. That's a great question. What I would recommend on performance and limitations is, first of all, there is a weight and balance. And if you look in the Airman Certification Standards, actually, let's go to the private pilot, Area of Operation 1, Task F, is a performance and limitations. The only skills that you have to demonstrate to the examiner is compute the weight and balance and correct out of CG errors to determine the weight and balance remains within limits of all phases of flight, and then use the appropriate airplane performance charts, tables, and data. So those are the only two skills required here. So the first one is weight and balance, and you can comply with that in a J3, no problem. The one that you're a little bit more difficult to demonstrate your skills is the performance charts, tables, and data, because you don't have any performance charts, tables, and data for the J3. So what I would recommend you do is get that baseline of being able to say, okay, my instructor and I, throughout my training, we've gone out and we've determined that the J3 burns basically 4 gallons an hour in all phases of flight. And here's how I determine that. And I can carry this much fuel in the aircraft. So this is my minimum takeoff fuel and my minimum landing fuel of what I'm going to take. And then my instructor and I have gone out and we've done tests on how quickly we can get airborne. And then we've timed a couple of climb outs to determine our basic climb rate. And so we've got kind of this back of the napkin type of performance data that we've seen over several different flights, because we don't have performance charts available from the manufacturer. So that'd be one way to handle it, is just get your own, kind of create your own performance charts, which is just real basic of, what's my typical takeoff and landing distance on this plane. And you'd want to do that over several different flights on a couple different days and kind of average it out, and then add maybe a 15-20% safety factor, and make sure you're explaining that to the examiner of how you determined all that. So that's how I would recommend it. That's not the only aircraft that happens with. I fly for a flight school here in Arkansas that uses MALs, and the MAL doesn't have performance chart information. They use the Cessna 172 chart. So that's a great thing for a check rideism, is maybe send them in with a Cessna 172 performance chart so you can demonstrate to the DPE, hey, I know how to use a chart, but I'm not really using this information for my actual airplane because it doesn't have its own charts. I'm just using this to demonstrate that skill for you. So I think what you're doing is actually pretty good. So just a layer I would put onto that is do your actual performance planning and make sure they show that to the examiner. All right, let's do 2 more, and then I'm going to have to cut it off.
2 more. Great. So Michelle Garcia on YouTube asks, when they receive an ATC clearance and the controller says turn left to 350, maintain 3000 until established, cleared for the ILS runway 25, what does established mean?
Oh, yeah, I haven't heard this question in a while. I actually went down the rabbit hole trying to define established with FAA language. The Air Force has some publications that used to clearly define what established meant. If you're doing an ILS, establish is you have positive course guidance. So that means that CDI has come alive. It's come off of the wall. So as soon as your CDI deflection isn't full deflection and you can see that CDI bar moving, you're now established and you can start your turn. If you're doing a VOR, what I would typically say is half swing on the CDI. So the CDI's come alive and you're half deflection, now you're established. And I would use that half establish for a VOR, or if you're flying an ADF, an NDB approach. So the GPS and ILS, as soon as the CDI is alive, you're now established. And if it's a VOR, it's just that half deflection. And that's because, and really, it depends on the VOR approach. If you're doing a 30-mile arc, I don't know if those exist, but if you're out there at 30 miles, it might be even less than half deflection since you're established. I believe the number was within 5 degrees of the course, you're considered established. So 5 to 10 degrees on a VOR, somewhere around there, that's considered established. So you can come off of that specified heading and start tracking that course inbound. But an ILS is a lot tighter tolerances, so as soon as that's CDI is alive, you can consider yourself established and you no longer have to hold that heading.
Adam on YouTube asks, in regard to slips, what is the downside to slipping base to final other than increased descent? And why, with it being so stable, is it not the standard with how often pilots get slow and skid base to final?
Well, as far as it not being standard, yeah, it is super stable, but you are, first of all, it's not comfortable if your passengers and even me as an examiner, like, you're kind of flying this plane sideways, so it's not the most comfortable thing to do. There's a lot of fun. I think slips are fun, and they're fun because they're kind of challenging, and you're putting the plane in somewhat of an unusual attitude when you're doing it properly. So I don't think it needs to be standard. In some airplanes where, we won't get into that, but the reason it's not standard, I think, is because the goal is to not need to use a slip. It's to manage your energy in a ball-centered, stable criteria where you're pulling the power and using the drag devices like flaps and speed brakes if they're installed appropriately to not have to use a slip. So that's why I think it's not standard. Now, as far as a base to final, I think that's a great time to slip. And depending on the aircraft you're flying, that might actually be the best time to slip because especially a lot of tail draggers that have really poor forward visibility, you may not be able to see clearly that you're high when you're established straight on final. You've got a big cowling that's in the way, and so you might slip entirely your entire way through the base to final turn. So if you watch anybody flying like a Pitts or a Kristen Eagle, a lot of those are going to use a forward slip all the way through the base turn for visibility purposes. So they fly a pretty tight base to final and use the forward slip so they can see. I do the similar thing in my Taylor craft where it's a tail dragger. I like to slip it in most of the approaches. It is not equipped with flaps, and I tend to fly pretty tight patterns while I'm flying that. And one of the things I like about it is if the engine quits at any point in the pattern, I can make the field. That's one of those things that I'd like to be able to do, kind of like flying a glider. So yeah, the forward slip, I mean, I'm not saying don't use it, but yeah, a base to final, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think that's bad at all. Thanks for joining us for another week of the VSL podcast. I hope you can join us next time. Go to the VSL.aero website to find out how to join us on our Discord. Again, there'll be a link to the Discord channel in the video that you're watching or the podcast you're listening to. If you don't have time to make the live stream, that's perfectly okay. You can send in your comments via email and I'll get to them. I actually had a couple email comments that I didn't get to this week. I'll get to next week. And you can feel free to answer or ask any questions if you join our Discord server in between episodes. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.